In our previous lectures, we've discussed Hitler and the Nazi Party. In this lecture, we turn to a discussion of Hitler's war, World War II. The Second World War was unleashed by Hitler in 1939 with some help from an unlikely newfound friend, the Soviet Union's dictator, Joseph Stalin. Until recently, ideological mortal enemies, these two dictators aimed by swearing a pact, the Nazi-Soviet pact, to bring about fundamental change in the world. Now, contemporaries had already remarked on some similarities, some intriguing resemblances between their regimes. We'll be discussing them today. The Second World War would see more violence directed at unarmed people. It would be an intensification of the patterns of total war that already had been, to a degree, evident in the First World War. On all sides, this perfected model of total war would take civilian casualties on a massive scale, especially in the terrifying war from the air, which at the end of the Second World War would usher in the atomic age. We need first to consider the road to war. World War II was very clearly Hitler's war. Historians have now been debating for nearly a century the reasons for the causes of the First World War. Historians debate far less the origins of the Second World War. Those origins have to do with Hitler's will, Hitler's desire for a great conflict, and what he hoped to gain from it. Forces had already been gathering for war in Hitler's gaining of an ally in fascist Italy and later his approach towards Japan. Both fascism and Nazism were distinctive as ideologies in the sense that they saw war not merely as a necessary evil, but looked upon it as a positive thing. Peace was the exception, as they saw it in human affairs, war the natural state. And for this reason, they would collaborate in the nearing conflict. As Benito Mussolini, earlier a model to Hitler, now increasingly his junior associate, drew nearer to his earlier disciple, he began to imitate certain features of the Nazi regime. From 1938, anti-Semitic racist policies were adopted, and thus it was hoped to give some racial coherence to the alliance between Italy and Germany. It was more difficult to explain why Japan should be an ally. The Nazis, after all, in their racist ideology, saw Asians as being inferior to European races, and thus some contorted racial justifications were found for alliance with Japan by claiming that they were, in a sense, the Aryans of the Asian part of the world, and thus were the allies. At the same time, Hitler and his associates viewed the Western democracies as weak and was convinced that, in all likelihood, further aggression, further invasion, following on that of Czechoslovakia, would not be met with decisive resistance either. Convinced of the weakness of the Western democracies, Hitler now resolved to attack Poland, disregarding the security guarantees that had been given by Britain. But there was one other fear that Hitler needed to deal with, and that was the anxiety about the position the Soviet Union would take in such a conflict. Hitler aimed to avoid a two-front war, that perennial nightmare of German politicians and diplomats, by a diplomatic revolution. He sought the cooperation of Stalin. This was an unlikely alliance, to put it mildly, because the communists and the Nazis had been ideological mortal enemies. But the start of World War II would thus be a common project of the two dictators who cooperated in facilitating its outbreak. Both of these dictators vested utopian hopes in this war, moreover. They believed that the conflict would usher in a new epoch, reordering Europe, maybe even the world, and hurrying the abolition, the demise of their common enemy, democracy. We need thus to consider a truly remarkable document, the Nazi-Soviet Pact. When news of the Nazi-Soviet Pact, a pact of non-aggression as it was formally known, signed on August 23, 1939, became known, it sent shockwaves around the world. It had been signed by the German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, and the Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, but it seemed still hard to believe. These regimes, after all, were sworn ideological enemies. They had vowed to fight for their respective extinctions. This very pact, now announced as an accomplished fact, seemed impossible. Nonetheless, the propaganda machines of both states, both in Nazi Germany and in the Soviet Union, literally turned on a dime, reversing their earlier denunciations of the mortal ideological enemies, and now instead heralding a new friendship, facing off against the moribund democracies of the West. This news came as a dreadful shock to true believers in either regime. In Nazi Germany, a joke circulated during the time that underlined the improbable nature of this new treaty of friendship. The joke went that after the treaty had been signed, Hitler had sent a special gift to Stalin as a seal of friendship. And that special gift had been a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf, in which he had laid out his plans for destroying communism, with certain sections personally erased by the Führer himself. What this underlined in joke form was the very improbability, the implausibility of what had just taken place. But we need to explore this phenomenon a little further to understand its deeper significance. Formally, the Nazi-Soviet Pact, as it popularly was called, was a non-aggression treaty, pledging not to go to war against one another. But it had secret paragraphs, secret protocols, which divided up Eastern Europe, independent countries, not belonging to either side, into respective spheres of influence. These two cannibals, in other words, Hitler and Stalin, were engaged in the exercise of carving up Eastern Europe among themselves. Western Poland and Lithuania, independent countries, were given to the Nazis, while Latvia, Estonia, Finland, and Eastern Poland were allocated to Stalin. Later, the Nazis exchanged Lithuania for more Polish territory. The cannibals were capable of polite negotiation over the fate of others. The consequences of this improbable treaty were significant. Hitler was now truly freed up to launch his attack on Poland. World War II, which broke out as a consequence, was in this sense enabled by cooperation between the two dictators. The Soviets continued to cooperate in this friendship by providing promised shipments of raw materials and supplies to Germany as a pledge of cooperation. Another consequence was that in earnest now, an era of massive modern population movements began. Now, population movements, the shifting of peoples from one region to another, had certainly earlier existed in human history. The historical accounts are full of the notion of peoples being removed from their original homelands. And this was truly a traumatic experience when it happened in such ancient times. It had been a practice of the Ottoman Empire, for instance, to use this for political purposes, to shift populations around from areas where it was felt they couldn't be trusted. It was this tradition that was ultimately radicalized in the Armenian massacres of the First World War that we've discussed in an earlier lecture. But now, the principle of political population movements became an organizing idea of the modern age on a scale that had not been seen before. As a first step, ethnic Germans were transported from the Baltic states, which were now taken over increasingly by the Soviet Union, and settled as colonists in conquered Poland, established in farms and houses whose Polish inhabitants had been expelled only days or hours previous. This was ushering in a new age of despotic movement of populations. We need to pause for a moment, however, to dig more deeply into the mystery of this tale of two dictators. Why would Stalin do this? Why would a man whose paranoia, whose distrust was legendary, who distrusted his own followers, who distrusted probably all of mankind, choose this one man, Adolf Hitler, as a man in whom to repose his confidence. This is a mystery that likely will never be entirely satisfactorily solved. Stalin's decision to trust Hitler remains obscure in the absence of Stalin's own personal testimony, but we can at least begin to understand this mystery by considering Stalin's ideological mindset. Without it, we will be simply at a loss entirely. The ideas in his mind, his expectations, his sense of what the future held in store are in part the key to this mystery. Stalin's Marxist ideology suggested to him that the Nazis were not so much a rival ideological modern movement of the sort that he spearheaded in the Soviet Union, but were rather the last gasp of capitalism. Capitalism at its most naked, undisguised, brutal self. The last episode of a world historical stage, not a modern contender for ideological supremacy. Thus, Stalin felt that playing for time would be crucial, allowing history to work its way out towards the inevitable triumph of the communist ideology. For Stalin, then, it might have made sense to seek to placate or appease Hitler, insofar as that was possible, in dividing up Poland and the rest of Eastern Europe, as a way of then redirecting Hitler's energies and ambitions westward, away from the Soviet Union, away from Stalin's own regime, against the other capitalist powers, to let capitalist forces battle it out among themselves in a battle royale. In the meantime, Stalin seems to have expected he would have gained time. Time to prepare, if necessary, for a future war, and incidentally, to mend the damage that he had done by his own self-inflicted purges that had done so much to cripple the functioning of the regime. In his expectations, thus, we might surmise, in the coming world struggle, in some sense a replay of World War I, the capitalist powers fighting in the West would be worn down, would exhaust one another in a battle of attrition, and Stalin then might ultimately hope to pick up the pieces of this world historical climax, ushering in a final triumph. If Stalin and his followers had paused to really carefully read Hitler's Mein Kampf, they might have had a more sober understanding of precisely where the ambitions of their Nazi ally lay in the long term, and they would have been less optimistic about the chances for avoiding this conflict. It was precisely this moment, this bombshell of the news of the Nazi-Soviet pact, that for many contemporaries seemed to bring into focus, at least briefly, some resemblances, some common ground, some occasions when the communist and the Nazi regimes could make common cause, revealing what some contemporaries felt to be affinities between these regimes. Regimes that were sometimes summed up in one word, in spite of their ideological conflicts, as totalitarian regimes. I want to examine the definition of this form of rule and its origins. Totalitarianism is used thus to denote regimes that were unlike the earlier tyrannies or despotisms of the pre-modern age. These were in fact supposed to be a new form of tyranny, which aimed not just at acquiescence, not simply at repressing populations and fighting off their resistance, but at something more, aiming at total control of populations through both terror and ideological belief and enthusiasm, demanding not just passive assent, but active participation and mandatory enthusiasm on the part of subject populations. Total regimes wanting total control of their population's heart and soul. The origins of the term are fascinating. In 1923, an Italian journalist who was critical of Mussolini's fascists had used the word totalitarian in his criticism of the fascists, saying that they wanted it all. Their ambitions were total, hence they were totalitarian. When Mussolini heard this term of criticism, he and the fascists rather liked it and accepted it now as a self-definition. A philosopher, I think one of the truly important political philosophers of the 20th century, Hannah Arendt, who was a witness to this period of turmoil in human history, used the concept of totalitarianism as part of an extensive study of the dynamics of such politics in the modern age. In 1951, at the dawn of the Cold War that we'll be discussing in a later lecture, Hannah Arendt published a large work called The Origins of Totalitarianism, which compared and contrasted the development of modern dictatorial systems, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, to try to tease out this new form of rule. This, as Arendt felt, very modern form of rule. Hannah Arendt, in her theoretical treatment of totalitarianism, didn't rely only on ideas and theoretical models. She also drew on personal observations. She herself was a German Jewish refugee from Nazi Germany who later settled in the United States and taught at the University of Chicago. Hannah Arendt remains a significant but controversial figure. As a student in philosophy in Germany, she had had an affair with one of her professors, Martin Heidegger, a philosopher who supported Nazism. This was a mystery of her personal life. Her later book, in 1963, Eichmann in Jerusalem, was both widely read and widely criticized for its concept of the banality of evil and other assertions about how the Nazi regime had operated, how the victims of this regime had responded. She had claimed in her concept of the banality of evil that the perpetrators of the violence of the Nazi regime in many cases were bureaucrats whose capacity for simply doing their job, even in genocide, revealed something disturbing about modern bureaucracies as such. She remains controversial. Let's examine now the essence of Hannah Arendt's concept of totalitarianism. Arendt was not the first thinker to note similarities between ideologically opposed regimes, even mortal enemies. Indeed, other contemporaries had suggested that extremes meet, that there was factors in common between fascists, communists, and the Nazis in how they practiced a politics of violence. Arendt, however, went beyond just this anecdotal observation. She instead systematically traced the model's origins. She saw totalitarianism as a new form of rule that grew out of the breakdown of 19th century classical liberalism, the breakdown of the nation state with its concept of equal citizens protected by the law. This breakdown had further been evidenced in the concept of imperialism and its rule over subject populations who were not accorded rights and privileges, as at least in theory had been the case in the liberal nation state. Totalitarianism in Hannah Arendt's model was thus, in a sense, imperialism coming back to Europe. Modes of rule and terror that had earlier been practiced out in the periphery were now re-imported into modern societies as a form of rule that was emphatically opposed to democracy and liberalism. Hannah Arendt cataloged in a structural analysis the similarities that could be observed between regimes like Stalin's Soviet Union and Hitler's Nazi Germany. Those similarities, just to mention a few, included the cult of the leader, dynamic claims of ideological infallibility on the part of the leader and the government, the use of violence to fulfill those claims or to make good on those prophecies, concentration camps as microcosms or laboratories of the most total achievement of the most radical aims of totalitarian regimes, hierarchies of true believers and elites who could cynically manipulate the masses of believers, institutions of enormous significance in such regimes like the secret police, the enforcers, and then the raw material of these regimes, atomized masses of people, no longer bound together in other social identities, but rather isolated individuals facing the government alone and organized by the regime into mass organizations. It was almost superfluous to note here that there were uncanny similarities in the monumental art and in the propaganda of the regimes Hannah Arendt described. As a final and essential feature of these totalitarian regimes, Hannah Arendt observed, They shared in common the need for constant motion. Hannah Arendt observed that when these regimes lost the impetus of forward movement, they threatened to topple over. And for that reason, these regimes tended to grow more radical over time. They pursued ever more ambitious, universal, global, utopian aims. The need to move towards that future would give them dynamism and force. Debate on the concept of totalitarianism raged after Hannah Arendt had articulated her theory. In the 1960s and afterwards, the concept was criticized very heavily. Some argued that in the context of the Cold War, the assertion that communism and Nazism had had similarities was merely a Cold War rhetorical tool. They further pointed out that in many ways it could be inaccurate in describing everyday life under dictatorships, where total control had not in fact been achieved by the governments, but where pockets of resistance could remain. Now, in fact, this was perhaps somewhat unfair to Hannah Arendt, whose theory had not claimed that totalitarian regimes had achieved total control of their subject populations. Rather, she had emphasized that while that total control might elude them, what was crucial was the aim, the ambition, the harboring of the notion that total control should and could be realized. Some political science studies, in fact, following up on some of Hannah Arendt's insights, were perhaps, in fact, too schematic and too rigid, and didn't take into account the pockets of resistance that might still exist in totalitarian societies. But then something remarkable happened in the 1990s, closer to our own times. After the revolutions in Eastern Europe, many Eastern Europeans who read Hannah Arendt's book enthusiastically endorsed her theoretical notion and revived this description of totalitarian regimes as they felt an accurate description of the sort of life they had endured. We've seen thus a fascinating renaissance of the term and of Hannah Arendt's thought. It's my conviction personally that Hannah Arendt's book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, is likely to be read hundreds of years from now for an understanding of the violent trajectory of the 20th century. Hitler now had been enabled through this cooperation of unlikely ideological opponents to fight his war. And this war was to be a lightning war, blitzkrieg, a strategy that the Germans had developed to overcome the immobility and stasis of the trench warfare of World War I. Instead, in this lightning war, tanks and planes acting in unison would decisively annihilate the enemy. Quick victory would allow the enemy's territory and population to be occupied and then exploited to pay for the next war. Blitzkrieg thus was supposed to be a self-perpetuating war machine. However, the Blitzkrieg idea, historians have pointed out, was also in some other paradoxical ways a symptom of Hitler's mistrust of ordinary Germans. To fight quick wars that could pay for themselves was supposed to allow Germany to avoid total mobilization. Thinking back to the First World War, Hitler was afraid of what might happen if the morale of the home front buckled. He believed in the stab-in-the-back legend, and he aimed thus to spare Germany mobilization. Poland was soon destroyed. An attack on Poland had commenced on September 1st, 1939. Britain and France then declared war, and World War II had begun. In spite of truly heroic resistance, Poland was quickly overrun. German airplanes bombed Polish cities and civilian centers, underlining the radical nature of this war. Special SS death squads called Einsatzgruppen, or Special Forces units, were sent in to decapitate, as the term went, Polish society by murdering those who were understood to be natural leaders, the intellectuals, political leaders, and clergy. For his part now, Stalin moved to clean and claim his share of the Soviet sphere of influence. Stalin moved into his territories to impose his communist order. On September 17th, while the Nazis were quelling their portion of Poland, the Soviet army moved in to claim eastern Poland. Those Polish officers who had retreated eastwards in a fighting retreat were now captured by Stalin. Thousands of them were shot and buried in mass graves in Katyn. This was a crime that the Soviet Union denied until 1990, at almost the very end, before finally admitting Stalin's role. Stalin soon forced the Baltic states, the previously independent republics of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, to accept Red Army bases in 1939, and then annexed them as Soviet republics, which supposedly had asked for voluntary admission into the Soviet Union in 1940. He soon began mass deportations of Baltic civilians in June 1941. Scarcely a family was not affected by these deportations, as overnight civilians suspected of potential political disloyalty were rounded up, put into train cars or cattle cars, and sent on the long road to Siberian exile, and the death that awaited many of them there. When the Soviet Union invaded Finland in the Winter War of 1939 to 1940, Finns reacted with a ferocious resistance and guerrilla warfare. The Red Army's dismal performance against Finnish irregulars revealed the cost that Stalin's purges had taken on the Red Army. Hitler now was free to turn towards the West. In 1940, Hitler attacked in the West, overrunning Denmark and Norway, and then defeating France in the course of 6 weeks. By June, Hitler celebrated what he saw as the overturning of the verdict of World War I. What the German armies hadn't achieved in 4 years of protracted trench warfare that he himself had participated in, the German armies had achieved now in the course of several weeks. Though Britain remained undefeated, Hitler now turned to his next goal, the conquest of living space for his master race in Eastern Europe. He now turned on his Soviet ally. Hitler's attack on the Soviet ally began with so-called Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941. With 3.5 million men, this was the largest invasion mounted in history until that time. In spite of repeated warnings, Stalin had refused to believe that the attack was coming. His ideological assumptions had blinded him to the treacherous nature of his own ally. Stalin reeled before the impact of this treachery, which essentially anyone but he could certainly have anticipated. Some historians suggest that he might have suffered a nervous breakdown in those first days of the attack by his former ally. But when he emerged afterwards and spoke to the Soviet population, he appealed to them to fight in a war against the foreign invader. He appealed in particular to Russian nationalism. This was a remarkable reversal. He announced a great patriotic war to expel the German enemy. Not a great communist war, not a great Bolshevik war, but instead a holy war for Holy Mother Russia to expel the foreign invader. Many ordinary Russians took this to be an implicit promise that if only they mobilized for the sake of Russia, then after the war, after its successful end, liberalization would follow. And indeed, mobilization was impressive. Part and parcel of Stalin's new tactic was an increased rapprochement with the Orthodox Church, which now was instructed to preach the message of a nationalist uprising against the German invader, now enjoying better relations with the Soviet government that for decades previous had persecuted the church. Hitler, for his part, declared that the war in the East would be a new kind of war, freed of the constraints of civilized warfare. This was to be a war of ideologies, racial enemies, a war to the death. This fact was underlined, in fact, in orders that Hitler handed down to the German armies, such as the Commissar Order of June 6, 1941, which instructed German soldiers to kill, on capturing them, Soviet political officers, the propaganda chiefs who were appointed to units of the Red Army, orders that were later extended to another group the Nazis would target, the Jews in the occupied territories, considered racial enemies. Soviet prisoners of war, many of whom didn't feel any compunction in particular to die for Stalin, were captured in enormous numbers in the first battles of the Second World War, of the invasion of the Soviet Union. They were put in camps, and the Nazis allowed them to die of hunger and neglect, considering them to be Slavic subhumans. When incidences of cannibalism broke out in these camps, the Nazi chiefs considered that funny. By the end of 1941, 2 million Soviet prisoners of war had died as a result of the mistreatment in the Nazi camps. Total war was now intensified. World War II would see an intensification of those trends that were already evident in World War I, especially in the mobilization and the targeting of civilians. The Nazis used slave labor. It became a crucial component of their war economy. In the occupied territories, especially in the harsh treatment of the Eastern European territories, the Nazis killed civilians in reprisal for partisan or guerrilla activity. Bombing of civilian centers became common, beginning with Nazi attacks on Warsaw in Poland, Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and Coventry in Great Britain, but then air war came back to Germany, where Allied bombing killed between 350,000 and 650,000 civilians. In a raid on Dresden near the war's end, up to 80,000, many of them refugees, were killed in this intensification of total war. The Japanese, half the world away, in their surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, brought America into the war, making it even more total. In August 1945, the United States dropped fearsome new weapons, atomic bombs, on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing an estimated total of 110,000. The Nazi regime, however, enthusiastically embracing total war, made the deliberate murder of civilians a special aim and project of its conduct of the war, and made it a cornerstone of its legacy that we'll discuss in our following lecture on the final solution.